All right, you're all now being recorded for posterity. All right, week 5 for those of you keeping track. So tonight, is what we're going to do. We'll start off with any questions. I'll do a recap, including one of the assignment answers. We'll talk about brown M&Ms, which will entice you to worry about why I'm talking about that. I usually exciting PowerPoints. We have a breakout group to work on stuff from this chapter that's going to be especially pertinent to the midterm. Then I'll go over detailed stuff about midterm discussion and then more questions and answers. So before I go forward, anyone have any questions on life, what it all means, anything that's happened that's not being listed on the agenda that you want to bring up? Found an interesting carnivorous plant. What do you got? No one likes plants? Well, okay. So week 4.
If you want to talk about carnivorous plants, I have a tiny Venus flytrap in a small light bulb kind of terrarium thing.
I had that young and I never got them to live. I would put flies in their mouth and they would die. So if you can get it to live, you're better than I am because I failed. I got used to those little things at Gemco. I'm probably, no one here remembers Gemco. They died about 20 years ago, but in the old days, Target was called Gemco. It was like Target meets, was that good Costco. Venus flytraps, I killed many of them. All right, so the one thing I want to bring up from last week's, again, last week, as I said, that second problem, which we did in class, 2 of you didn't pay attention because I cried visible tears when 2 people didn't get that question we worked out in class. We work it out in class, and I post the answer on Canvas. Everyone should be getting it. But, aha, Dallas is here. All right, you with us, Dallas? You there, Dallas? Are you muted, Dallas?
I am here.
Oh, okay. Anyway, we're just starting our agenda. I've shared my screen. And I just started telling people that if anyone who didn't get that number 2 problem from last week, when we did it in class, post the answer, people need to look at their notes because there's no excuse for that one problem wrong. But the other problem I want to talk about on the agenda is the problem 1, which is question 2. And if someone messed up on this, it was basically on part A. And it's because they basically got the definition mixed up and put their 10 claims and 6 hours in the wrong spot. And it was basically just like, many of you wrote down the correct equation in variables, I equals C times R, but then stuck the things in the wrong spot and made the I into one of the 60s or the 10s and the division instead of something like that. And that's the main reason someone messed up. It was just that probably in a hurry, didn't read it. But again, go back to this in the basics when you take a problem like this, and there's a good chance something like this might be on the midterm. Who knows? Well, yes, I know. But think about I always remember it, and it's not how the original was written, but the I, average number of things in the system, I always remember for things in the system or in transit. They're in the middle of stuff. In transit, in the middle, whatever it does. T should be easy. Throughput time is the T, and R is for the rate. So when you get something like this, the average flow rate is 10. Cool. Rate R, that gives you your I equals T times R, 10. And then average time, well, average time, average throughput time. Think about that. So the main thing, someone got probably in a hurry and got this in a reverse order, one divided by the other, and that's when someone got it wrong. And usually it's because they just put the wrong thing in the wrong order. That's how it got messed up. The second one is the flow rate part, and that's when it goes down and says, oops, it gives you the capacity in the question. It gives you the 7 and the 10. It says is the demand for claims to be processed is 7 per hour, and the capacity is 8 per hour. What is the flow rate? Well, most people did the minimum. They remembered it as the minimum of the stuff, but they forgot that there's another element, and it's the supply, demand, capacity. And you actually did the supply. The average flow rate is 10. So what your average capacity is what people forgot. They just did the 8 and the 7, and they came out with the right answer. Because in this particular case, the one missing element, which was that 10 from part A, happened to be bigger than the 7 and the 8. But if you do that on a problem in a midterm where that 10 is less than the 7 and the 8, then you would have got the problem wrong. So people who skipped and said, oh, never mind about the things coming forth, called that 10, supplying, people who forgot about that still got it right because 7 is less than 8. But don't always count on the fact that supply number 10 is going to be less than the other two. So I bring that up here, and because in another problem, it could have messed you up if you forgot about it, and several people did because they just took those 8 and 7 parts from that part B. You might get it wrong on a different problem. So remember that supply, demand, capacity minimum, and make sure you have all those three accounted for in case next time you have a 6 for that 10. Clear as mud? You don't believe me, Aaron?
I believe you.
Okay, trust it. You did like sort of say, I'm not sure, but as you go through that flow rate thing and the minimum, make sure you're not missing one of those items that are supposed to be in that minimum to determine where you're going to get your flow rate. Make sure you have them all encountered, because even if you got it right, some of you got it right for the wrong reason, because 7 was less than 8. Alrighty. Now then, I'm going to talk about brown M&Ms. And this is where I talk about some things after the midterm. Some people are going to start to get hit a little more hard on some things on the assignments you turn each week. Because each week, and I get maybe 1 or 2 people commenting a week on the comments I make on you. A lot of you either don't read the comments I make within your document, but if you start to worry, especially when we get close to the end about, oh, I'm borderline between this grade and that grade, when I do make comments within your documents, it's the assumption that you might, unless you get 50 out of 50, which if you get 50 out of 50, usually I don't comment. But if you have something that you got docked for, I will comment on it. And some of you are making the same thing that I comment on week after week, which tells me you're not going back and looking at the comments. So sometimes it's worthwhile to go back and say, what am I commenting on? Even if it's a page number, and Joanne's not here, but who else is the person that had me before knows that page number is the thing that irritates me the most in life, page number locations. But go back and read some of the comments, because it also shows me how closely you're paying attention to what's going forward. I bring this famous brown M&Ms. True story here. And anyone ever hear of the group Van Halen? I think are they all still alive? Don't know.
Oh yeah.
I know they're still performing, but it doesn't mean they're all the originals performing. Aren't they the ones that got that new guy? Pardon?
Eddie just passed a couple weeks ago.
Really? I missed it. Well, they're one of the great management examples we use for all sorts of classes. And this applies to reading the notes I put on your papers to make sure everything's going to be kosher going forward. Because if I remind you about something 3 or 4 times in a row, and it comes up after the midterm on your next assignment, I'm going to start being more critical on how much I take off, because I'm tired of making the same comment every week. Professors need to look for something to excite themselves. But they had one of the things they did, and it's a great lesson for operations, project management in general. They had the brown M&M clause on their contracts at any venue they performed. And it's highlighted here where they talk about munchies they're required to have. Potato chips with assorted dips, nuts, pretzels, M&Ms, warning, absolutely no brown ones. 12 Reese's peanut butter cups, 12 assorted Dannon yogurt on ice. Now, why would a band do that? They're probably just eccentric rock stars, tripped out on acid. Yeah, That's probably why, right? They knew when they walked into their dressing rooms, if there was a bowl of M&Ms with no brown M&Ms, 12 peanut butter cups, people would get the 12 peanut butter cups and that, but no brown M&Ms, that the people they were doing business with read the contract. In our case, the syllabus. And that it was genius for something going back to the early 80s. They didn't have to go through, sit down with someone in a business meeting and say, look, blah, 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 this. They looked and said, they must have read it. No brown M&Ms. If brown M&Ms are in there, not only did they have an excuse to violate the contract, I mean, it's in bold. M&Ms, no brown ones. It didn't matter if there was a plate of 2 M&Ms. It would have been with this contract as long as they weren't brown. And so it's a great lesson in management and how we grade things in school, but in paying attention to the details to make sure everyone's performing in whatever process you've got up to speed. And nowadays, they still do this because it's sort of out there so much, but for years they were written off as these eccentric rock stars. Someone probably was scared by a brown M&M in their youth and never wanted to see them again. But no, they had a purpose to what seemed like just a mad, eccentric quirk. For that one issue, they could tell whether people had taken their requirements seriously for that venue they were playing. It was brilliant. It was one of those, I wish I'd thought about it. I always look for those brown M&M things, like exclusions I can put in life that say, now I don't have to read the entire whatever. So anyway, lesson in life is great. This is a great lesson in life and how you can figure out what's going on, especially those of you in IT who we're all going to have a project management experience, because those of you who take my IT classes or my project management classes will hear me say that you're expected to be able to manage processes and projects just by virtue that you have some form of IT affiliated major. And you may have heard me say this before. It may not be fair, it may not be right, but you're expected to. So we make you take a project management course in most of your degrees. All righty, enough on brown M&Ms. So chapter 5 that's not chapter 5, it should be chapter 10. Who wrote that on there? Oh, gotta edit that on the fly. Okay. Now we're back. That might have ruined the whole evening. All right, forecasting. The art of producing future events. That is an APA appropriate credit, by the way, at the bottom. But all right, and this is the best line from the early in the part of the chapter, which is really, it is ultimately an art form that we're trying to put science onto. And it's sort of, I spent a lot of my time in my career forecasting everything from heart transplants to births to how many microprocessors that Chevrolet is going to need, all sorts of things. And the one thing I've been able to do with a mathematics background, I've been able to hop from industry to industry doing this, because the variable change, the math doesn't. The math doesn't. So here we go, forecasting decision making. Forecasting demand from operations output. And that fits most in the context of what we're doing. There's all sorts of forecasting you do. Part of this, human resource requirements, financial requirements. We tend to look at this more so far on that service versus operations for physical stuff. So forecasting, what we think demand will be. Planning, what we think demand should be. And it may differ from sales. Give me an idea why sales may differ from demand? I'll give you a hint. What was everyone looking for in mass amounts about 6 months ago?
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper. Why did sales differ from demand?
Because there was none.
Bingo! Things like that. And if you're a producer of toilet paper, why 6 months? Why in September didn't you predict we need the massive amounts of toilet paper that we needed in March and April?
Because they don't work for Congress.
Good answer. Okay. But ultimately, things come out of left field. How many people in September were saying, gosh, I got to prep for that Corona stuff that's coming in the spring. Whew-y. And you know, the one thing people are going to want, no, it's not corned beef and canned goods to survive for weeks. It's toilet paper. Oh, and hand sanitizer. Might need that too. That's part of forecasting. Did toilet paper manufacturers around the country mess up on that forecast? Yes. Should we fire them all? Not necessarily. Okay, now qualitative. Two types, qualitative, quantitative. Qualitative is basically when you sit down and say, I think this is going to happen. And you get all sorts of nominal group techniques together. And if this is live class, I actually do a thing where we all get Post-its and take judgment calls on a certain thing, that an item we put up on the chalkboard. But basically, and I have a video on the Delphi technique that's very short, but basically you come up with what you think is going to happen through some opinion-oriented, not number-crunching nature. Qualitative, same thing of quality. Quantitative, quant, the Latin for numbers. And that's what we're doing. Delphi technique, I just put a focus on that one because people see that and say, what? That's like one of those spy movie things, isn't it? Market surveys, life cycle analogies. If some of you have had, well, most of you have at least one management course where you talk about product life cycles, how things increase at certain points of their life cycle and decrease when they're matured, no one wants it anymore. And informed judgment, which is the most experienced people guessing in a group. As much as these may get poo-pooed, it's probably the single most intensive method used. People sitting around saying, yeah, I think that's going to happen. So Delphi technique, a quick video on that one just to show you. Hopefully it works. If you can't hear it, by the way, anyone hear that?
Let's take a look at the Delphi technique of group decision-making. In the Delphi technique, the members of a panel of experts respond to questions and to each other until reaching agreement on an issue. The first step is to assemble a panel of experts. Unlike other approaches to group decision-making, however, it isn't necessarily to bring the panel members together in one place. Because the Delphi technique does not require the experts to leave their offices or disrupt their schedules, they're more likely to participate. The second step is to create a questionnaire consisting of a series of open-ended questions for the group. In the third step, group members' written responses are analyzed, summarized, and fed back to the group for reactions until members reach agreement. Asking group members why they agree or disagree is important because it helps uncover their unstated assumptions and beliefs. Again, this process of summarizing panel feedback and obtaining reactions to that feedback continues until the panel members reach agreement.
Now then, sounds all well and good. Now, one of the important things I bring this up because I see this done a lot, and there have been tons of studies on this. Who makes up the panel makes a tremendous impact on what decision they make. If you have a bunch of finance people in the room, and one of the people there is the CFO, who makes the mistake of saying what his opinion is up front, what do you think opinion most people are going to select? If there's an authority figure in there, and that's why when this goes to the Delphi technique, and it sort of says certain things very cursorily, like, yes, everyone writes down their responses to the key thing is if someone writes down the responses independently of everyone else, they're less likely to be influenced by someone unless you just do a roundtable and say, okay, Ray, tell me what you think. Then Aaron, you tell me what you think. And then Ada, you tell me what you think. Oh, Andy, then you tell me what we think. Dallas, you tell me what we think. If Dallas ranks everyone in the room, his opinion will dominate everyone else's. And what his opinion says will go. And so when you do these type of Delphi techniques, and they're part of a broader things called nominal group techniques you may see in a big management class on behavioral sciences and management. It's trying to mitigate the level that authoritative opinions have to get everyone to give their own opinion. Because if you do a Delphi technique, everyone who's there is assumed to have some level of knowledgeable authority. It doesn't mean authority over other people, but authority over a knowledge base to bring to that. And if someone else ranks that person and speaks first and is identified as speaking on a position, it blows the whole thing up. And so when you deal with these things, and I've been in many of them, when you're in government, they love these types of techniques. But one of the things they never do well is isolate authority. If you we have public forums all the time where we have, umpteen people from mayors and all sorts of congressmen and senators saying, let's have a town hall on something. And the ranking person there, if the person there is a US senator, people are going to defer to what they say versus a congressman versus the local mayor. And so these are the types of things you have to worry about when you're doing these types of techniques. Not going to do the market surveys and stuff, you can look at those types of things yourself, but I bring that one Delphi technique because the things that apply to that apply to so many other similar techniques. Delphi, don't worry about, maybe one day someone's going to quiz you on what is a Delphi technique. I'm not going to. I'm more worried conceptually about what's going on, because it's just one method. Nominal group technique is what we call it, and Delphi is one term under that. Don't worry about memorizing nominal group technique. It's a bunch of ways of just getting disparate people together to make a decision based on their individual knowledge bases to come together. All righty. Quantitative forecasting methods. Time series and casual. This is where some people will say, be afraid, be very afraid. But we'll get through this. You survived last week. We'll get through this. Now then, I bring this up because the book says here are their time frames they're using for their discussions. And I only put this up here because it's what the book says they're using. This is not necessarily industry norms. Whatever organization you're working for will have their long-term, short-term, intermediate plans. When I was doing the forecasting for shared services at Providence, I had a quarterly plan, I had a 1-year plan, and I had a 5-year plan. Does that fit in these? No, these aren't necessarily wrong, but wherever you work, you're talking about what I have to report on or to make decisions about, just make sure whatever criteria your organization is using, you know it. So you don't come up with a 5-year plan when they're saying, no, our long range is only 2 years. Just make sure whatever context you're working in is there. Organizations have different criteria. That's the whole point of this. Different organizations use different time references. Just deal with it. That's what happens. Oh, that's the angry, my son liked that angry bee. Alrighty. Time series forecasting. Now, this is where you think about what is the nature of what you're trying to predict? What does it do? How does it have a level, average going across time? We already talked about, in our chart or our previous X charts and B charts about trending and averages, where things are going. Seasonality, one of the big things, and when I was at Providence, I used to have to predict how many babies we're going to have because it required staffing and other types of issues to make. Well, I hate to say it, but babies occur at very seasonal trends in this world. The same number of babies that happen in September are not the same babies that are delivered in December. And it became a very big resource issue, staffing issue, because if everyone wants to go home for Christmas, but there's not going to be people in the NICU center for that, you have to worry about these things. Different seasonalities come. How many people buy their barbecues in December? I do, but people don't buy barbecues in December. I got my last barbecue in December. It was like half price. But people buy barbecues when they start thinking about barbecue. It's a very seasonal type of issue. Or if you're producing barbecues, you better know when you have to have your production processes ramped up to be there for the seasonality of it. And that's why seasonality becomes very important. Long-term business cycles. This is the great, we talked about a few minutes ago about where are you in the life cycle of your product? Are you starting off? Is it a fad where everyone's going to want everything right now? And 6 months from now, how many people remember Beanie Babies? I had people that put their IRAs into Beanie Babies, back in the 90s. It was a fad, but it had a massive growth cycle. They couldn't produce them fast enough. People paid thousands for a blue lizard that 5 years and later wasn't anything to talk about. But from a standpoint of that was very cyclical and it was very, very trendy. But what drove the prices up? And people couldn't get their blue lizard, and everyone needed a Beanie Baby. Cabbage Patch dolls happened like 10 years before that. That was in the 80s, where people had, everyone see that movie Jingle All the Way with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sinbad? That similar thing happened with Cabbage Patch dolls, where people were like physically assaulting each other in Toys R Us.
Oh, wasn't it the Tickle Me Elmo was like that too?
Oh yes, another good one. Things like that come up. Production and forecasting weren't in line with each other. Causes dichotomy. And not only is it that the public gets not angry with the company, but the company, when they miss this, misses out on a huge opportunity in sales. Because they don't have that things where people want them. How many people are fighting over Tickle Me Elmos today, this Christmas? Baby Yodas are actually doing okay, because everyone predicted Baby Yoda would be the hot item. And when I went to Fred Meyer earlier this week, they had tons of them. Because they were expecting Baby Yodas that came out. I don't get Disney, so I don't see Mandalorian, but I know of it. And I saw for $19.99, I got a Baby Yoda at Costco for my wife. Gives her advice during the day in her office. But so these are types of things where we have to care, because it's either are you gonna miss the toilet paper train, or the Baby Yoda train, or the Cabbage Patch doll train, and not have it there and need it, and miss out on potential sales? Or do you have too much? Do you predict that people are going to want too many of something, and you don't have it? One of the big things that happened a few years ago on the I'm blanking out the name now, but it was billed as a female Viagra, and drug companies lobbied Congress, paid millions of dollars to congressmen to get this finally passed over the FDA's objections to have this drug that had to do with female sex drive. It was billed as, again, the female Viagra version. And they ramped up. Everyone thought it would be great. They pushed so much into getting this passed. And when it did, no one bought it. And they had warehouses of this pharmaceutical just basically expiring. So it works both ways. If you overpredict, you lose money because you're spending things producing widgets no one wants. If you don't get it right, you're missing out on sales and profitability potential. Enough said. Let's get another thing, the moving average. Everyone get that? Spend 5 minutes on this graphic. Moving average, it's moving around, an average moving on the screen. Get it? Okay. Sorry, my wife had about the same reaction you guys did. All right. Now then, assumes no trends, seasonality, or cycle. Basically looks at whatever happened last, and what last means is 1, 2 periods, 3 periods. You can't do an average on more than, I guess technically you can do an average on 1 that ends up being the same, but however many periods, the book usually deals with 3 years or 5 years, or 3 periods, I should say, 5 periods. You take what's happened over the last 3, whatever it is, months, years, whatever your time period you decide is appropriate. And you basically say, okay, take 3 of those. If you got 3 periods, you take those 3 demands, divide it by 3, and that's your new forecast, next period. Brilliant, wonderful. If you got a very steady state type of thing to deal with. So you talk about the examples we talked about, don't necessarily have that, but that's the simple moving average, and it's used at nauseum because of its easy to calculate nature. It's overused. Now then, weighted moving average. Here's where we say, oh, we're really brilliant. Well, we realize that sometimes certain areas in the past might not be fully represented. If you're in a heavy, heavy growth cycle where your sales are growing each month over the previous month, then maybe your forecast should be more weighted towards what happened recently rather than what happened 3 months ago. So you say, I'm going to apply more weight. So you apply a weighting factor to 3 months. And maybe you say, okay, W1, which is that weighting factor, gets 50%. And W2, the one period further back, gets 0.3, 30%. And then last one, 0.2. Okay, and that's a great thought, because in a heavy growth cycle, you might say, yeah, we're growing fast. You know, we can't say we're going to grow as fast as we did that last month, but okay, if we're growing, we want to use the most current month as the most realistic for predicting the future. And it's great, except for one thing the book doesn't go into in a great deal of depth, and that is, well, there's a judgment call in assigning these weights. You know, how do you really determine that W1? Do you get a qualitative group together and say, hi, we're going to have this quantitative thing called weighted average. Who thinks the first W should be 50%? Let's all put our normal group techniques together and everyone come up with your best estimate. This is only as good as the accuracy of your guess of the weights. It makes you look a lot better when you're presenting your presentation to a board, but the weights you assign is the Achilles heel of this process. And the book comes up with things saying, oh, we're going to supply 50% to here and 30% there and 20% there. It doesn't talk a lot about where you come up with those things, and that's the issue. Is it's a great technique if you have a good way of determining the W's or the weights, which then becomes a whole other process you have to do before you get to the simple part, the weighted moving average. Enough said. So this is a truncated version of that diagram from page, 193, which I think is kind of confusing because it talks about forecasts, but the way the diagram puts it together, it never really goes to the forecast. You have a bunch of history that goes through what, period 15, and says, here's how you get the forecast, and you're trying, but the way it's presented, it's like, we're forecasting something for a period that's already happened. And that's where I think this gets confusing. If it wasn't confusing for you before, I'm confusing you now. But ideally, period 1 is in the past. Period 15 is the most recent past. So as you go down here, your demand, 3-period moving average, this is a simple moving average, not weighting yet. For period 3 is you look at the previous 3 periods, including 3, and say, okay, 29 plus 18 plus 10 divided by 3 is 19. That's the moving average at that point. But you do that over time for every period, right up until we're living, this assumes we're living in period 15 right now. And we're going back and seeing what's happened historically. So that same calculation to get that 19 in the 3-period moving average column is the same thing you did to get the 20.7, except for 20.7, you did 15 plus 29 plus 18 divided by 3. And it's moving in case that every time you go down a period, you move the 3 items you're using for your average. Okay, and then they have this nice diagram that says, okay, the forecast for period 4 is 19, which is the 3-period moving average at the end of the previous period. So if you were living in period 3, none of this 4 through 15 had happened yet, and you want to say, what's my prediction for period 4? It's the 3-period moving average for the period 3. That becomes my prediction. And what messes people up on this is that at 15, they don't have a period 16 prediction. But there really is one, because the same reference that made you say, okay, the forecast for period 4, based on period 3's moving average, you can apply down to 15 period and say, oh, okay, that 22.7, 26, okay, that becomes my period 16. And for me, that's the period, the problem with this table is that they don't really predict the future yet. They just give you the elements to go forward, but they don't really say, okay, what's going to be for 16 in a clear way. That's essentially what you're doing. You do this, and that gets your forecast, and then you can just write in what we think for 16, because 16 hasn't occurred yet. We're in that micro period of 12:01 midnight. We just finished period 15, and we haven't done 16 yet. And you just carry it down to get your future predictions. Now, the error part is the most overlooked part in these type of processes because it gets complicated. And the book doesn't do a good job at going into detail about this. It does talk about different ways of calculating error, and I'm not going to go into that really heavily. I don't think I have a single error question other than what is error on the midterm. You write that down. If I'm wrong, call me on it in 2 weeks and we'll figure out something, make it nice. But the error column, from my standpoint, is a philosophical issue which allows you to figure out how bad you've done what you've been doing and pay attention to it. Because if you're always off by 12.7, as we have in period 6, that really shows you're doing some really rotten things, and maybe you ought to figure out a different way to do your predictions. Okay, maybe you go to some weight that makes sense if you're growing. Now this one, there's not a huge amount of growth. It's almost sporadic. If you look at the actual demand, that D1 column in the period, it's all over the place. So I don't know if people are making a decision whether there's an R in the month or whether Seinfeld repeats went back to season 1 that month, whatever it is. It's there's not a pattern I can see here. I would actually use a regression analysis on this. Don't ask me why, that's a few slides ahead. But the error is jumping all over the place. And it tells me you're wrong most of the time. Now, all forecasting is wrong most of the time, but this is very wrong. And so you can actually, I don't want to make anyone explode, but you can actually put these forecasts on a control chart and say, what is my variability that's acceptable? Not be asked to do that, but I just bring that in the context of last month. You can actually track your forecasts in a control chart, in a range chart, and say, how really random am I in this world? Is a 3-day moving or 3-period moving average any better than just sitting around in a room guessing? A lot of times it isn't. And so we graph these, and here's your actual demand and your forecasting to show you, this is just sort of how they interact with each other. I actually find, and I put a lot of graphs up here because they work so much better in presentations. People will see this and say, oh, that's nice. They see this and say, wow. And then in a little bit, we're going to talk about trend lines you can put on top of this and say, ooh, here's what it really means. But here's our forecast versus what actually happened. And it's all over the place. But it tells you we got work to do. Now, moving averages, we do the exact same place and put the exact same data, except we have a linear forecast. Now then, out on, I'm going to make you go wild for a bit, but I think I put it out there. If I didn't, I will stick it out quickly. Let me go back to this. Week 5 forecast calculations. I'm going to put this up I'm pulling this up on the other screen. Give me a minute. And open with Excel. All the calculations I've done for everything here. If you go onto Canvas, you'll see an Excel file like this. Give a minute to come up. And all the calculations I'm doing and how I get them are here. All the stuff I'm talking about. Week 5 forecast calculations is on Canvas. You can pull it up to follow along at home. But this has how I got everything. So you can click on this and say, okay, oops, cancel, enable editing. Oops, got to enable editing. If you can't remember how I did this, okay, you click on here. Come on, click, don't make me a liar. and click on what I got stuff from. You can click on here and say what I'm using that for. So all the stuff I'm doing for you is out here in Excel. You can pull it up, follow along at home, go back to it later. Now, weighted moving average. How did I get that? Well, I used the same example out of the book. I came up with this same data from 10.3. I came up with W1 is 50%. How did I come up with that? ISIS came down in a dream and said, put 50% on W1. Okay. Again, you can spend a whole set of meetings coming up with how to determine those W1, W2, W3s. But this is now equal to 50% times the most recent, 30% times the second most recent, 20% by the third most recent. And that, oops, that comes with that. And you do the same thing all the way down every time using 50% most recent, 30% second most recent, 20% third most recent. That gives you this trend. Now, is it hugely different than the first one? Well, it does do a little bit of job because instead of just trending up and up and up, it shows a little mitigation related to what history showed. It's not going quite up as fast. It's sort of leveling out. So is it better? In this case, yes. Is it always going to be better? Well, how good are you at setting your weights? You can hear me say that type of thing over and over, especially when you get to exponential smoothing, we have the same issue. The weights are key. How good you're about setting those determines whether this is an appropriate method or setting. And people write PhD thesis on industry effects of what the right percentages are for this in healthcare, oil production, cattle production. It's an Achilles heel that most textbooks don't like to deal with. And they sort of just say, here, use this. If you use these 50, 30, 20 in your company, maybe it'll work. God bless you if it does. Alrighty. So that's where you come up with the moving average on those calculations. And so in this particular case, it's a little less volatile than the pure, 3-month average. Is it right? No, but in this case for trending, and that's where you look at your forecast, and that's why I put this trend in here. And this is actually a little forecasting, or I should say, what do you call it? Foreshadowing, not forecasting, to the future quantitative chapter on when we get down to how you do residuals and R-squareds. In Excel, this is maybe too much information, but you can actually, oops, there you go. If you got a set of data like this, you can actually have a thing called trend line. And this is going a little bit ahead to regression analysis. And so I'm going to do this over again. You click on some data, you click on this, and you can say, okay, format trend line. And you actually get an equation. This is, again, we're about in a minute when we get to quantitative, but you can say actually here, and you actually get an equation to appear that says what your forecasting should look like. I want to get trying to get my corner thing so I can make it bigger. But this equation is actually the equation of this trend line, which is great for forecasting. It's tricky if you don't know what you're doing, but basically it says, here's the equation of this best fit line. And when it comes to these trends in the old days, and in the modern age, it's not as fun because we now have computers that want to do it. We get data like this on these moving averages, and we get a ruler and say, what do you think it best fits to follow this trend of the individual points? We stop the ruler and draw a line through it, and that'd be our forecast for the future along that line. Nowadays, we have Excel that does it for you with a right click on the line. It says here, display the equation, and okay, you can use that for your forecasting. Again, it's a regression analysis, but when you get to the regression analysis section, It's a way to do regression analysis without having to understand the math at all, but you can look brilliant. Okay. I'm going fast for this, so just tell me to slow down if I have to. So, again, weighted moving average, we just took the same thing of before, 50% times that 29, it's the one before, and this is the equation of how they got it 21.9. And you go on the Excel spreadsheet, if you don't believe me, and click on the cell. Exponential smoothing, one of the most confusing labels ever. But basically, it's basically a fancy way of saying, in the book calls it, where does it says? Down here, say, why is it exponential smoothing? Because it can be shown mathematically that weights on each proceeding's demand data point decreases exponentially. When I read that, it doesn't make me feel any better about why I call it exponential smoothing. But basically, when you base forecasts on forecasts on forecasts, you tend to smooth out the data a bit. And that's essentially what it's saying. It's trying to take what essentially the weighted moving average and what the weighted average is trying to do and say, okay, here's how we're going to smooth out this based on the volatility that might occur that you might see in that moving average. We're trying to smooth it out to get a nice, because we want a nice clean forecast. But, so it has this nice thing. It says, okay, here we've got our alpha times the demand at this time. You know, the actual is going to be equal to the 1 minus the alpha times the previous period's time, or previous period's average. Cool. Who can tell me what the Achilles heel of this is?
The weight of the alpha.
Absolutely. They use in the book 0.1. How do you come, but it really doesn't get into how do you come up with that alpha. And again, this can be very useful in trending things out, but that alpha determination, just like that weight determination in weighted moving average, is the key. But beware, it's out there. No, you're not. Again, you can, if you want to get your PhD in operations management, you can focus on alphas and how the best way to predict them are. And there are books out there that say for certain type of processes, here's the right type of alpha to use based on industry standards. There's tons of information. You can Google it. That'd be a great discussion forum sometime. Remember that, make a note of that. But to have you find, not this year, don't worry about it, but I got my discussion forum set, but for next group, that'll be a great thing to have you guys research an alpha specific level for industry. But okay, the smoothing constant is meant to stop those volatilities that showed up in that graph and say, okay, here's what's happening in the past, here's what's going to happen next. How do we smooth that out? And that's the exponential smoothing. Again, only as good as the alpha, just like weighted averages are only good as the weights. So here's an example outside the book. I predicted, this I think was like personal savings rates. And you're saying, okay, 1963 forecast is what you're looking after. All righty, well, what do you know? The new, I didn't get that T. That should be an A sub T, sorry. So your newest one, you're looking for 63. So the A minus the last forecast you did in that forecast column using this method was 6.3. Now the reason that is grade on that first year, 1961, because that's the first year we don't have any past data. So when if you're going to start this in a big level of data for historically and otherwise, you know, your first year, you just use whatever actually happened. Not important for a discussion, but just if someone says, where did you get that from? Well, and again, this is, again, on the Excel spreadsheet, if you're wondering where the math came from, on the, where is it? This is all here, the calculations. So if you're not sure how I got these numbers, that spreadsheet I posted on Excel has all the detailed numbers.
Seems like a dumb question. I'm not really familiar with Excel. I have it open on my other side. How do you find the formula of that? Because when I'm clicking
Oh,
each cell,
okay.
it's just saying like 6360.
I mean, if you click on here and click in there, it'll highlight all the cells you use. So in this one here, which again, without it, 6.2, I'm on year, what, 1963. Well, F7 is the previous year. Okay, which goes down to that formula. I don't want to jump around too much. We'll go back for a minute. 1 minus F4. The alpha is up here. F4 is the alpha. So I have F4 times the previous period savings rate, the actual, plus 1 minus the alpha, that 50%, times F7.
It's for some reason that's not coming up on mine to the right of the function, the FX. It's just all blank.
Is blank up here when I'm moving?
When I click the cells, it's just.
Well, if you click the cell itself, you might see the formula like this. If you have this open, you just click on the cell. Any cell, it should show you a formula.
Yeah, it's. Oh, never mind. It is. When I click all the way to the right under forecast.
And if you click inside, it will highlight everything that it references. You still have to look and say, oh, F7's over here, but that's where it goes. So I'm going to jump back to this. Oops. And so this is where that 1 minus 50%, that was that up there, to generate, your 1.63 came from the previous forecast, and 6.0 was the previous rate. And you come up with your new 6.15, 6.2 for that 6.2 for the forecast, that 63 or 1963. And it's a way of forecasting to give you a weight that makes it a little smoother going forward. You're not going back 3 periods, really basically going back on a previous forecast and a previous actual. It's used moderately often. I don't think it's one of the most popular ones because it's a bit like this when people go deer-eyed at control charts, you get that variance. And we hear a term like exponential smoothing, it tends to turn people off right away. It does have uses, again, but my biggest criticism personally using this solely is that it has that alpha factor. And if you're going to, the short answer to what do I do when I do this on a professional basis, I do my forecasts multiple ways and look at them and say, okay, then it comes down to what looks reasonable. And I say, whatever I do mathematically, weighted average, exponential smoothing, regression, the last step is a qualitative step. I come up and say, here's what the data potentially shows. Do we think it's reasonable? I don't use one or the other. And sometimes the qualitative portion is just me or me and my client, or in past me and my boss. So I say, look, here's what the data shows. What do you think looks reasonable? But I will do the math and then make a decision about which math makes more sense given what else is going on for other people's opinions. So that's what I do. That makes sense? Anyone with me? Anyone not with me? It's okay to say no.
It's just kind of a lot. Trying to
it is
contextualize it.
But again, basically 3 types of things are trying to go from something that's purely, potentially really volatile without looking at seasonal trends like moving average. Then you're trying to add a little bit of trending to it with the weighted moving average, saying that I believe what happened yesterday is more important than what happened, Monday. And that's where the weighted moving average comes in for it. And then this is trying to say, okay, we know what happened yesterday, what we thought was going to happen yesterday. Let's combine them a little, and so that what we thought was going to happen yesterday should incorporate other thoughts. And let's use what actually happened to come up with the future part. And that's what this exponential smoothing is trying to do, is say, okay, given that we had this predicted did or did not happen. We give this much weight to what's going to happen on that 50% times that last period stuff. And so we use that 6.0 to predict the 6.3. So now we're going to say how much weight should we care about that? And that's really the key part, is how much emphasis should we give? We incorporate that previous period actual rate to predict forward. Now actually what actually came out was 5.4. So we were wrong either way. Because historically we know that the actual happened at 6.3. But when we predicted this in 62 to get our 6.2 forecast for 1963, what we knew was that we had a previous forecast of 6.3, a previous actual 6.0. And that's one of the things, when you look at these charts, think about where you are at the time. When you're looking for the 1963 forecast, 1963 hasn't finished yet. And you're saying, where am I halfway through 63? But it's after 62, because you know the actual 6.0 for 62. And that's where I think the book doesn't do a good job, because it doesn't do you well in placing you, saying, look, you're here in this time period, looking at what's happened backwards to predict what happens forward. And that's why I think the book doesn't do as good a job. Because at this point in time, when we're predicting that 6.2 in the forecast for 1963, we're sometime after the end of 1962. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that that 6.0 had occurred. But we do know that we predicted 6.3 based on that forecast column. So given what we predicted and what happened, we're trying to incorporate last year's predictions with last year's actuals and say, no, here's that smoothing constant, which is, again, the Achilles heel. Say where we're going. Is anyone more valid than the other? Well, if you've got a potentially huge growth industry, something that's going to be really not trending much, exponential smoothing or weighted averages are good for something that's you think it's going to increase a lot or decrease a lot. Weighted moving averages are good for things that you think are going to be steady over time. I should say non-weighted moving averages, 3-period moving averages, are good for things you don't think there's going to be a lot of volatility, a lot of growth. We're going to go more or less on average. Weighted smoothing average, weighted, we think that we're going to have some change, and whatever the change is going to happen is going to be more reflective of what happened last month than the month before. Same type of thing this way, gives you a little bit smoother. When you graph these numbers, they tend to come out a little smoother. But it's a lot, math-wise. But again, it's one of those things where what they're trying to do, you got to get your head around, but the math is actually done. It's just a plug and chug math. How are we doing?
I think that's a great explanation. I just I don't want to hold the class up either. I'm not really familiar with the math itself, so I'm trying to formulate in my head just what the different symbols and so forth mean.
In this part, we're just doing arithmetic, and getting used to Excel can be part of it. You don't have to use Excel for this stuff, and there are huge software. In fact, there's actually I didn't want to go there because I want to teach Excel. There's actually an exponential smoothing function in Excel where you can highlight the previous stuff, the actuals and forecasts. I'm not going to go into that here, but you can actually do it, and it'll give you a number. Just like there's a weighted moving average function. These actually, but I'm not going to go into those now. It's easier to just do it manually like this because they'll come up with slightly different iterations sometimes. Oh, and then again, this is the old formula up there. The alpha dt was 1962 6.0, 1 minus 50% times the previous period's forecast, that a minus t. Now then, here's the one that everyone should run screaming. It's 401. Anyone need a break before I do this? No one's saying yes. I will keep going unless someone says yes, or I see their face just fall on their desk and their keyboard starts typing things randomly in chat. Okay. Now then, regression analysis. They leave a different couple of ones. This is the one I'm going to bring up, focus on, because when you get to this, it gets the regression, econometric model, input-output model, simulation model, Lord help me. Regression is the one you're most going to encounter because it's the easiest to do for that same reason I showed you a while back, which is Excel does it really automatically. And I'm going to go through some issues on my examples. And if you go through, you'll find a regression part too, which deals with the exact same example on page 201 with data. Now then, well, the whole idea between regression analysis is the assumption that you can find that whatever your essentially demand is, and whatever demand is could be for anything or it could be for people, populations, that one thing is dependent on how big another thing is. That's the essence of regression analysis. You can put something on a graph and say this, you can graph one thing along the x-axis, not along y-axis, and y-axis is usually something that's dependent on the x-axis, and say as one variable changes, it's based on the fact that this other variable is changing. In this case, they're saying the number of bikes we sell is dependent upon the population in the city. Simple model, but they're basically saying, yeah, demand for bicycles is dependent on the number of people in the city. Now, these can get very, very complicated very, very fast. People in the city, how many people are under 50 versus that, and you can come up with all sorts of ways to complicate this quickly. But this is essentially saying, I've come up with two things. If you get your old math school thing up, you can say dependent versus independent variables, meaning that one variable is depending on what another variable is to figure out what it needs to be. And this is that old, if you remember old graphing from the algebra, y equals, well, in my days, it was always mx plus b, but y is equal to some slope times a variable plus a constant. So, or y equals mx plus c, whatever, they use different, what do they use in the book? Y is equal to ax plus b. In my day, it was always mx plus mx, or slope, plus b. They use y equals a plus bx. Same stuff. Don't get held up with this. But in this case, I'm looking at page 200, they're saying y, and they have that little y with a hat. I have my own hat here. Y is demand and population. So the y hat is equal to b, some value against the population that will predict y. We propose that y depends on x, i.e. there's a causal relationship. And that's when they talk about these causal forecasting methods, that one variable causes another to happen. Now then, there's an Achilles heel for this too. Who besides Ray can tell me what an Achilles heel might be for this? In general, not for this particular example, what's in a general problem with this that might happen with these causal relationships? Anyone again?
You could have other variables.
Other variables, and I would actually say, how do you determine which ones are them in the first place? If you can find out, and this is a huge data crunching issue, but if you can find out something that it depends on, cool. Then you've got something you can start collecting data on. And how many of these widgets will make your demand for whatever you're producing happen? That's the hard part. Is it takes you a lot of research sometimes to find out what the two variables are, or two or more variables are, that's going to make it happen. That's the Achilles heel. So, bicycle shop, y equals a plus bx. What a is just some constant. A might be the minimum number of bikes you're going to sell historically, whatever it is. You look up historically and you sell at least 3,000 bikes a year. How many more than that depends on how many old people are in your town versus young people versus general population, whatever it is. Now then, so all I've done on this graph here is graph the data. Now then, you wonder, how did I graph the data? Well, I just took that data and put it in here, and I created a graph. If you really want to go to it, you can data, wait, where is it? Insert, I think it's under insert. You can, scattergram, oh, where is it? Where's my scattergram? Oh, there's a scattergram. Again, I'm not making this Excel class, but, oh, I thought I was doing the same one. But you can just say scattergram, and then you say select your data. Okay, select my data, and I have demand, which is that. Cool. And I have an x-axis, which goes along here, which is this stuff. So all I did is graph it. Now then, the book quickly goes into a, hey, you can take table point 6 and using things such as Excel, Minitab, SPSS, GMP, or SAS, oh my goodness, almost if you had a discussion forum asking you to look for these types of things. But there's tons of them out there. But you can get very sophisticated things that'll do this for you. Okay. Do you need it? No, it's an Excel. But all you do is plot the data, and then you click on your series, and you do the same thing I did earlier, and say, add trend line. And I already did it. And I said, click these little things, equation on chart. And this equation gives you a way to predict future data. It uses something called a least squares series culmination. Don't worry about what it is. Just go with it. Anymore, I said, don't worry about some of the formulas, how they created those things from the X-bar charts when you had the average chart. Accept it for what it is. But this gives you something where you can now say, okay, if the population X is this, say it's 4.5 million, whatever it is, times that, minus that number, that can give me a prediction that's time independent. And just use that 1 point. Now then, someone might say, but the book said my A should be minus 1.34, and I'm looking at on page 201, my B, it should be 2.01. Can't you professors ever agree on anything? Well, that's just a question of the number of iterations, and this is getting more information you want to know, but I get students asking, why is the example you did live in the class slightly different? 2.01 versus 1.997. Is that depending how powerful your machine is and how many iterations, because this is a series culmination where basically the computer behind the scenes is going through iteration after iteration after iteration. And the 2.01 is probably more accurate than mine, because when I do these live classes, I don't want my computer to do more than 50,000 iterations. So it comes up almost instantly. And if he said he wants to do it 500,000, he might get a different number. But bottom line is, it's basically saying, based statistically, behind the scenes, the computer is going back and forth saying, okay, this way, that way, this way, that way. It's guessing, is the real answer a little bit above this or a little bit below, until it finds something that really fits that best fit line. And that's what that equation is for this dotted line. And it's basically going back and forth between the data saying, what equation can I come up with that's going to be as close as possible to always being the least variant from the points of data I know. You don't have to care about that. Just understand that the computer can do all this for you. Statistical packages do this very well for you, because ultimately you're trying to come up with an equation that says, I can predict how many bikes I'm going to sell based on how big that X is. And if you have more than one X, you might have population, again, number of people over 65 or under 65, number of newborn babies that might need bicycles in 2 years. There are all sorts of complications you do. But this is the essence of regression analysis that says, hey, how you can do this? If you can graph the data. I know graphing is something a lot of people don't have a lot of experience is. As I keep saying, I said it twice before, learn Excel. It's the biggest thing you can do for hiring practice. It's always in the top 3 new hire qualities that employers want. Now then, on the midterm, I'm going to have you graph some data and come up with the best fit line for regression analysis? No. If this was operations management 2, the answer would be yes. You do it multiple times. But I need you to go through and understand conceptually what's going on with regression, what it's trying to do. Is basically take data points and come up with essentially what is, other mathematicians would hate me using this terminology, but essentially, what is the average line you can create from these data points? What line of prediction can be created mathematically from these data points? And that's what this little dotted, again, best fit line that we used to do manually. And the computer does this by just doing iteration after iterations from a least squares iteration. Again, don't worry about what that is for now. But it's basically using a mathematical algorithm to come with the best prediction so that you can use this. And every time you get a new data point, maybe this was a few years ago, this year's, every time you get a new data point, like this year closes and you find out what your actuals are, you rerun this regression. And the more data points you have, the more accurate you can get over time. Unless you're in a really weird business cycle and all of a sudden no one wants bicycles, all they want are segways. But that's what we're trying to do here conceptually. Again, don't worry about trying to recreate this too much, but understand what you're trying to do with regression analysis. The others, input-output model, simulation models, they can be really good, but they're overly complicated. But regression is number one you're going to encounter there all the time. And people do this all the time, even if they don't really understand the math behind it. I encounter it all the time because in the modern world of Excel spreadsheets, you don't have to care about the math. You just, if you can figure out how to graph your data, you can do this and look brilliant. Okay. So, oops. Next one. So, selecting a forecast model. Oh, I thought I got rid of all this stuff. All right. Using decision characteristics. Scheduling decision. Facility expansion. Short range. What are you trying to do? Again, on these forecasting methods, as I say, for me personally, I always find I do them all. Not that hard to do. If you got data on one page of spreadsheet, it's not hard to do all these and then hold meetings with people say, here's what I predict based on this. If you're pushed to make a decision, no, do your best. I have them all there. And I say, this is why I'm doing this. The famous thing where I was in a meeting when I was going through this on, actually it was at Mentor Graphics. And they were coming up with, I did actually a regression analysis on a prediction. And they were much more used to complicated this is where the guy that loved the Monte Carlo analysis. And when it came up, I was asked, why did you predict this forecast method? Why did you use this regression for this? And I just said, your guess is as good as mine. And so I was waiting for them to say, what else? No one said anything else. Okay. Another similar one. I'm not saying you're not recommending this. It can be, if you don't know your audience, this can be your career limiting move. And when another time I was asked the same thing, I said, why'd you use this? I said, why not? Now, that actually had a little clout because I actually came up with this year before I started doing this. I had an outrageously lucky forecasting experience on claims worldwide, and I was within like 1% of something, and no one ever argued with me again. But come up with a reason. What you know. Data availability is huge. If you don't have a lot of data, a regression analysis, which is integrity goes up with the more data you have. I can do a regression analysis on one point, theoretically. It doesn't mean it's going to give me any good data. I can do a weighted moving average on one point. They'll come out to the average. Actually, no, you can do 50% on one and nothing, zeros on the other. But the amount of data and what type of data you have to predict things. If you're going to say something that's dependent on something like a regression analysis, you better have some evidence to say, I can say this is based on this. This is dependent on this. If you don't know, then you got to do something that really doesn't care what the data elements are, like a weighted moving average. exponential smoothing. Again, exponential smoothing, you don't need a couple of periods data to do that. Weighted moving average, you usually need at least 3 to 5 periods of time to do that. When you look at how you calculate the exponential smoothing, you need last year's forecast, last year's data. Basically, you need a couple of years worth or a couple of periods worth of data. I always say years, but years worth of data. So that's when you say availability and quality. Quality is the biggest thing, garbage in, garbage out. How accurate is the data? That should be something that's given. And the pattern of the data. Nice thing about regression analysis, it can deal with unstable patterns. When I use that first example on the average moving forecast, I was able to do a trend line through that. If you got enough data to make a prediction, unstable patterns and regression analysis work together to come up with here's how something can predict in between those lines to make something that makes sense. Again, is it right? Most often, no. We're not right most of the time. All right. I only put this in here because it's generally good advice, but this collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, someone wrote a paper and coined this, and that's why it's in the book. But I'm not gonna say a lot other than it has a lot of what I would call well-duh elements to it. Aim is to achieve more accurate forecasts. Who would have thought? Share information across the supply chains with customers and suppliers. We had that cross-functional issues within our organization, but also your suppliers and customers will work with you too, if you can trust them, and saying, hey, we're going to predict this. Can you fulfill this? What are you seeing going on? Because your suppliers, if you're the one that needs paper pulp to produce your toilet paper, and you predict you're going to need 10,000 more rolls than normal in April of this year, you're going to make sure your paper pulp producers can actually produce that for you. So you work across those suppliers. Compare forecasts. Again, that's where the error comes in. Look at why you were wrong. Most people don't do this, quite frankly. Government is failing on this all the time in my experience. I've worked with state and local governments. They hate to look backwards because no one wants to say why they were wrong. That's my political pontification. But go back and see why you're wrong. What messed up? What didn't you know? And B2B, business, works best with a few customers. Work with them to figure out what you can do, what you need, what's going to be out there. So, breakout groups today. Who needs a 5 or a 10-minute potty break before we go into breakout groups? Was that a yes, Aaron, or I saw?
Sure.
Sure. All right. I'm going to pause. What time is it? 4:20. Should we be back at 4:30?
Ra.
Okay. Being recorded nicely, and the system says it still believes I'm here. Okay. You may have heard we got a midterm next week. Anyone heard about that? Cool. I hope so. Everyone just sort of looked glazed. So next week, first off, there's no Zoom class meeting next week. I'm going to post at 5:51 the Zoom link for the next week's class appears, but I'm not putting it out there yet because I don't want someone to think they suddenly missed a Zoom class next week because they suddenly seen something. They're so frizzled by midterms that they try to meet next week when we're not. But we will have on week 7, but next week there's no Zoom class. I will be available for Zooms outside the class time because I recommend you don't do it during the class time because it's due at the end of that class time. But if you want to meet, talk about anything we got on what's going on this or any concerns you have, I'll make myself available all week long. I'm not leaving town. The following week I am. But so no Zoom class. There's no Greek letter assignment next week. You do still have the week discussion. So your deliverables next week, you don't have an assignment that's due. You don't have a midterm, but you have a midterm and a discussion still. Those are your 2 deliverables next week. There's no live class and there's no written out assignment thing. So if you're looking for it on Canvas, you won't find the assignment, but you still have the discussion group, and you should probably be able to see the midterm exists, but you can't access it until 12:01 a.m. on Monday. Now then, it's submitted through Canvas. It's multiple choice, true, false. There's only 2 true, false. You can take it any time during the week, starting at 12:01 a.m. on Monday morning. You must complete it by 5:50 p.m., which is when the theoretical ending of this class is. It's a 2-hour time limit. Once you start it, you can't pause it. So if you get it, start it, and your buddy comes over and says, let's go to McMillan's, they're getting the band back together, it'll keep running without you. And it'll clock out. At the end of 2 hours, it submits automatically whether you've answered 1 question or all. I think it might be 20 or 21 questions. Someone's gonna ask how many questions. It's about 20 or 21. But number of questions is gonna help you, because some of them are gonna be like 5-second answers and some of them are gonna be 5-minute answers. So a number of questions might make you feel good to say there's about 20 questions. Some are workout problems with calculations, and some are, is the sky blue type questions, definitional questions. So it covers the chapter readings, assignments, videos, and from weeks 1 through 5. So if you got my syllabus like I have it, that includes chapters 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, anything else on here? Nope. Now then, calculation-wise, you are going to have a flow chart with different element times on it for the process, which, yes, they are not all going to be in the exact same time frames. So you're going to have to figure out things like throughput times, bottleneck, average, whatever it is on that flow chart, which is stuff we went through in class. There's not going to be anything more complicated than we did in class on the assignments, that type of stuff. But you're going to have to be able to know the basic calculations for all the throughput. Basically, if you're going to process flow chart with times per whatever, and number of people doing that job, and be able to turn that into an average throughput, bottlenecks, and those types of things. Okay. Now going on between, we have, came next? Oops, that one, wrong page. And let's see, you're going to have, are you going to control chart stuff? You're going to have stuff in that chapter 8 and 9, where you're going to have to, whoops, hold on. Getting over to my right page so I can, my post-it notes match up. So you have chapter 8 requirements. There might be an MTBF question on, just like you had in the homework. There's not going to be anything more complicated on the assignment. So you can figure out what was on the assignment on that chapter. You'll know what's on here. Definition questions are all part of that, going to be incorporated in everything. So I may not have gone through every single definition, but know the definitions. And again, it's open book, open notes, whatever it is, 2 hours. Corny as it sounds, I found students, it's one of those, when you're on an online class, it's a, yin and yang about that. People tend to study less with an open book test, but they also tend to run out the clock more. A closed book test, people tend to finish it earlier, but they don't run out the clock. So there's no trick questions on this. When it comes to quality control on chapter 9, yeah, are you going to have some control limit questions? You're going to have some, control limit questions on, what's the control limits on a P chart? What's the control limits on an average chart or an X bar chart? You're going to be asked to do some control limit calculations. I'll give you the stuff, the information. Your job is to figure out, is this a P chart or an average / X bar chart type of stuff. Nothing tricky. The only tricky thing I might do is I might give you more information than you need to calculate it. You have to figure out the parts you need to calculate it. So not intended to trick you, but you'll be able just so you can pick out and say, oh, I need that. I need that type of thing. Let's see. I don't go into a lot of the other diagrams too much. So I'm going through my notes as I'm talking to you. So all we're done tonight, I guarantee you're going to have to do either a calculated or, excuse me, calculated, weighted, or regular moving average, or an exponential smoothing question, just like we did tonight in the breakout sessions. If you can do one of those types of things, get the pieces that you're given, and make the same calculations you did tonight, you'll be okay. That's just it. So that's the basics of it. Again, definitions are going to go through it. I'm not making you do a regression calculation. Again, everything's multiple choice true false, so I'm not going to make you plot a scattergram, but conceptually know what a regression analysis is for and how you get it. Because there is some questions about not calculating it, but why do we care type. I always describe it as why do we care? To understand why do we care. That's my main emphasis on that chapter is the regression analysis. I don't go too much into other stuff, but there are some definitional questions out there. They're simple. Again, it's going to range from the questions you have to spend, 5 minutes on to ones you're going to say, oh yeah, that's fine. And that's mainly it. Is there time-wise, you say, is it weighted to any other chapters? Question-wise, no, but I think the calculation questions are longer. So the calculation questions are worth twice as much as like a definition question. It's 150 points. And so generally speaking, a question you have to do a calculation for are worth 10 points. One that's just like a definitional multiple choice true false question are worth 5 points. And other advice I give you, if you're zooming through one calculation question but not another, don't freak out, because I guarantee that someone else was going to zoom through the one you didn't and went through another one really fast. So again, don't look at like, oh, what's the hidden meaning, what he's asking for? I'm not trying to trick you. If you can do the problems you've done in class and the ones you've done in the assignments, you should be fine. Don't get held up on the variables like that when I talked about just earlier. No, think what you're really being asked and go for it. The ones that causes most trouble for people are the flowchart questions. And the flowchart questions from what chapter, is that 5? If I get mixed up on the chapter, and units are the biggest thing that trip people up on flowcharts. As I said before, they don't get their, whatever it is, widgets in the process in the same number of units. If you're being asked for a throughput of what 1 unit takes to go through the process, you don't compute all your time or process elements into the same one, whatever unit. And so you mess up in that regard. And that's one of the most common things I see trip out on those flow charts is they're in a hurry and they don't know that one thing says I do, half a unit per hour. The other one does 0.7 units per hour, and they like add it up without realizing that you're being asked to get 1 unit through the whole process and how long. And they'll add up rather than calculating what it takes to make one. If something takes 0.75 hours, how many? That's 45 minutes. Get everything in the same units when you talk about your process flows. I guarantee you, the example I've given you, you have 4 problems based on the same flow chart, if memory serves, 3 or 4. I don't think I took it out. So again, you're on your own. I'll be, if anyone wants me to talk about anything separately, just let me know and go with everything. I'll be available next week, most of the times, except Sunday. I take my son Sunday afternoon. I take my son to the pumpkin patch, so I won't be available Sunday afternoon. So after that, I'll be available tomorrow. So don't hesitate to say, hey, can I chat with you on Zoom for 5 minutes about whatever? We'll set a time and we'll be there for it. Any questions before we go up? So I do have one question though. the breakout rooms for the next starting in week 7. Like we've done Star Trek and we've done Lord of the Rings. My son wants Harry Potter. Does anyone have a preference for a genre of what they want breakout rooms called? If not, you have to put up with Harry Potter because he said like, oh no, do Harry Potter. So no complaints. You had a chance to say you want something nominal like breakout room 1, but okay, so it'll be whatever my son chooses. All right. Any last questions before I sign off and send you on your ways? Again, we're not meeting as a class next week, but don't hesitate to reach out and say, hey, can I have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour of your time between now and it's done? You can take the midterm anytime starting as soon as it appears. If you any problems you have with it, if you try to take it at 12:02 and it's not there, let me know because everything on my end says it should work. In fact, where is it? Hold on. I'll show you what I'm seeing and what you guys should see. When I go, I'm going to share my screen over here. Quick share, but when I go to next week, everyone should be able to see it. I see this week 6, work plan for week 6, discussion forum, and the midterm fall 2020. And we click on that, it should say something rude like, can't do anything until 12:01 at October 26th, which is Monday morning at 12:01 a.m. If you log out at 12:02 a.m. and can't do anything, shoot me an email right away. I'll be monitoring it all week to make sure you can access it. But if something goes wrong, let me know.
Shouldn't that technically be 12:01 a.m.?
What did I put on there? It should say
12:01
you're right.
p.m. is
whoa,
noon.
Dude, you're absolutely right. Oh,
Thank you.
that's extra credit. So that means it wouldn't be ready until noon. 12:01. There'll be a minute after noon. I will go change it to AM just in case one of you wants to get up at 12:01 a.m. to take it. But it should be. You're right. It should be AM.
I'll still be awake.
Okay. You don't have, there's no penalty or benefit for taking it early. Just remember that 2-hour limit. And if you start it on on Thursday at 4 o'clock, and it goes to 5:50. Well, it'll stop at 4:50. Or you start at 5 on Thursday. It doesn't care. Your 2 hour at 5:50. Even if you haven't used up your 2 hours, it'll stop. It'll stop at the end. It'll auto submit at the end of 2 hours, or 5:50 p.m. on Thursday, whichever comes first. So make sure your internet's set up right. You're not having power outages. Don't rely on Starbucks. And anytime you want to take it all week, no penalty for taking last minute, no benefit for taking earlier. It's whenever you're ready. Alrighty. Any questions before I say end and send you on your way? Alrighty. Good luck, everyone. Call me for anything you need to talk about during the week, to go over anything you want. I'll be available.
All right,
Thank you.
take care.